So, Michael Pittman Jr. finished as the wide receiver 15 in a half PPR and the wide receiver 13 in a full point PPR this past season. Do we think that he's able to make the jump into being a low end wide receiver one? Well, one thing to remember is that Anthony Richardson didn't play with him very long. It was mostly Gardner Minshew. So, we're going to take a look at these splits with Anthony Richardson playing and then project out what his season might have looked like with him at the helm. Look at his situation, his advanced stats, and then what we might be able to reasonably project. And finally, look at where he's going in redraft and dynasty, and then assess some players going before and after him, and whether we agree with the general consensus as to who's going before and after him. So Michael Pittman Jr. is 6'4", 223 pounds with 71st percentile arm length. Then he's 26 years and 8 months old. So within the age 26 season, and he's going to be 26 years old for essentially the entire NFL season, no matter what. So historically, when we look at data, we're going to consider him as a 26-year-old wide receiver. When we look at his metrics, he is a very, very good size-adjusted athlete. So to begin with, his 4.52 40-yard dash is 61st percentile in and of itself. But because he's 6'4", 223 pounds with that 4.52, that gives him a 111.2 speed score, which is in the 94th percentile. Then when we look at his burst score, which is his broad and vertical jump, his 122.6 score is in the 57th percentile. As well as his agility score of 11.10 is in the 69th percentile, and his 10.26 catch radius is in the 89th percentile. So this guy is not only a very good athlete, he's an incredible athlete when you adjust for his 6'4", 223 pound frame. Now, in redraft, he's going off the board as the wide receiver 15 overall. Players like Chris Olave, Devontae Adams, Ayuk, and Evans are going before him, and then players like Jalen Waddle, Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, DJ Moore, and Deebo Samuel, as well as Cooper Kupp, are going after him. Then when we look in Dynasty, he's going off the board as the wide receiver 16. Players like Chris Olave, Drake London, Waddle, Ayuk, and Odunze are going ahead of him in Dynasty startups. Then you have Pittman at 16. Then we have Devontae Smith, Nico Collins, DJ Moore, Zay Flowers, and DK Metcalf. So what we're going to do is delve into a couple of advanced stats for Michael Pittman Jr., look at targets per route run rates among wide receiver ones, examine his situation, as well as look at 5-year averages for wide receiver ones in terms of targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns, and then look at his splits with Anthony Richardson in the lineup. When we look at Michael Pittman's counting stats, his 109 receptions were good for 4th, his 1,152 receiving yards were good for 14th, and his 513 yards after catch were good for 10th. Then when we look at a couple of advanced metrics, his 2.08 yards per route run was good for 23rd, his formation adjusted yards per route run of 1.70 was good for 28th, his 53.5% total win rate was 15th in the NFL. That's really, really good. When we look at his win rate versus man specifically, his 47.9% was good for 8th. That's very, very impressive. His 2.15 yards per team pass attempt was good for 14th, and his 4.6% juke rate was good for 13th. So what we have here is definitely a very, very good wide receiver. He plays a big Z role for the Colts. So overall, these are very, very impressive stats, and should lead you to believe that he is definitely talented enough to potentially be a wide receiver one. So theoretically, to be a wide receiver one, you should generally be able to draw at least the 12th most amount of targets per route run. When we take a look at Michael Pittman Jr.'s targets per route run rate, this chart is through week 16. So through week 16, he was good for 10th. His end of year finish of 28.1%, however, was good for 8th in the NFL. So in terms of his ability to draw targets, he was 8th best in the NFL. So theoretically, that also means that besides the fact that he looks really good when you look at his counting stats and his advanced metrics, he should also be receiving the volume necessary to potentially be a wide receiver one. When we take a look at wide receiver one marks to hit, over the past 5 years, 1 through 12 every season has averaged 144.6 targets, 97.4 receptions, 1,311 yards, and 9.5 touchdowns. Now, this past season, in 16 games, he had 156 targets, which was good for 9th, 109 receptions, which was good for 4th, 1,152 receiving yards, which was good for 14th, and 4 total touchdowns, which was 43rd. Obviously, he did miss one game. It was due to a concussion. So what I did is I divided his numbers by 16 and then multiplied by 17 to get what his numbers would have been if he had played a full season. So if he had played 17 games using his average stats, he would have had 166 targets, 116 receptions, 1,224 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns. So when we take a look at his 17-game pace, his 166 targets easily would have beaten the 144.6 average. His 116 receptions definitely would have beaten the 97.4. His 1,224 receiving yards would have been a little bit below the 1,311. And his 4 touchdowns definitely would have been below the 9.5 average. Then I also compared his 17-game pace in terms of total half-point PPR and full-point PPR points, as well as the average of these wide receiver 1 marks in terms of half PPR and full-point PPR. So using his 17-game pace in a half points per reception league, he would have had 204.4 fantasy points versus the 233.6 average, so right around 29 lower. Then when we take a look at his 17-game pace in a full point PPR versus the average, his 262.4 points over a 17-game pace would have been 20 short of the 282.1 average. So while some of these marks are a little bit over in terms of his targets and receptions, his yards and touchdowns would have fallen short enough to where he would have been a little bit outside the average range to be even a low-end wide receiver 1. So Michael Pittman only played in 4 games with Anthony Richardson at the helm. 2 of those games he played 96% or more of the snaps, and in the other 2 games he played 32 and 33% of the snaps. So it's going to be a small sample size here, but in total, in the 4 games, he had 35 targets, 22 catches for 220 yards, and 1 touchdown. So Anthony Richardson played 96% or more of snaps in 2 games, and then he played 32% in one game and 33% in another. So what I did is I took Michael Pittman's stats at face value for weeks 1 and 3, where A-Rich essentially played the entire game. Then what I did is I looked at the play-by-play of week 2 and 4, where he played 32 and 33% of the snaps, then figured out in the time in which Anthony Richardson was in the game, Michael Pittman's targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns, then divided each of those by the percentage of snaps in which A-Rich played, and then multiplied it by 100 in order to extrapolate those 2 games all the way through. So when I add these stats from the full games of A-Rich and the games extrapolated out in which he only played 32 and 33% of the snaps, divide it by 4 and multiply it by 17, using that, he would have had 182 targets on the season, 123 catches, 1,135 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns this past season. Meaning, he would have finished as the wide receiver 12 in a full point PPR and the wide receiver 15 in a half point PPR. Then when I take the 5-year averages, his 182 targets would have been easily over the 144 necessary. His 123 receptions definitely would have beaten the 97.4 average. His 1,135 yards would have fallen pretty short of the 1,311 average, and his 4 touchdowns would have fallen well short of the 9.5 average. Now, using the 5-year averages for what it would take to be a wide receiver 1, in a half-point PPR, you would need 233.6 points, and he would have finished with 199. So on an average year, he wouldn't have been a top 12 wide receiver. Then when we look at a full-point PPR, on average, you would need 282.1 points, and he would have had 260, so a little bit short of the average to be a wide receiver 1 as well. So what this tells us is that potentially this past season was a little bit of a down year. I mean, we did have injuries such as Justin Jefferson, and then Jamar Chase was injured, and he also didn't have Burrow. So there are multiple factors at work here. But yes, technically he would have finished as a wide receiver 1, albeit the lowest wide receiver 1 possible in a full point PPR, should A-Rich have played. And he would have finished as a mid to high end wide receiver 2 in a half point PPR. So on average, he wouldn't have been a wide receiver 1, he would have been a wide receiver 2, although a solid wide receiver 2. Then when we think about where he's going in redraft, sleeper redraft specifically, he's going off the board as the wide receiver 15. What do we think about his situation this year? Well, A-Rich is back. They do have Joe Flacco, so if A-Rich were to get hurt, that actually potentially could be better for Pittman. Now, they did add A.D. Mitchell. He's going to take over Alex Pierce's role. And I do think he's going to draw a couple more targets per game than Alec Pierce did, but I think that's more so going to hurt Josh Downs than it is Michael Pittman. He's still going to be the top dog easily in this offense. So I think he's being drafted right around his ceiling because I don't expect his production to get too much better in a redraft league. Then when we look at Dynasty, he's going off the board as a wide receiver 16. I mean, players like Nico Collins, I think in the future you can expect higher end production from. DJ Moore, maybe this next year once Keenan Allen's gone. Zay Flowers is a lot younger. It's kind of a toss-up. I might rather have Pittman than Metcalf and Tank Dell. So I think he's going a little bit high in Dynasty, but not excessively high. So personally, I don't think that we can reasonably expect wide receiver 1 production unless there's injuries to other players in this offense, and he receives at least the same level of quarterback play or potentially better from A-Rich or Flacco. One thing to add is, as a rookie, he only played in 13 games and had 1 touchdown. Then in his second season, he had 6, and the past 2 seasons, he's had 4. So he's just generally not averaging the touchdowns necessary to finish as a wide receiver 1. And I really think that's the biggest impediment towards him finishing as a wide receiver 1 on an average year at least. So if he's able to develop more of a connection with A-Rich and have a better touchdown year than his average at least, I do think there's a theoretical potential for him to be a low-end wide receiver 1, considering the volume is definitely there, the receptions are definitely there. It's just the yards and touchdowns are lacking. But I do think that's his ceiling as a low-end wide receiver 1. So I think he's being drafted fairly because he does have the theoretical potential to exceed his ADP in Dynasty and Redraft. It's just that you have to consider age in Dynasty, and then in Redraft, are there players that have more potential upside that are going later? I think so. But regardless, he's a very, very talented wide receiver, and I hope you've liked what you've seen. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Thank you, and have a good day.